series. My name is Professor Julian Adgerman, and I'm the coordinator of the Cities at Tufts program, which is an attempt to bring together people across the university and in our communities around the university to think about the urban as a site and source of inspiration, and a site and source of scholarship, and as a site and source of partnership with local communities. So we're very excited at this first event, and I'm going to hand over to our student Nick Pittman, who is going to be the moderator of this event. Nick.
Yeah, so hi everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. I'm Nick Pittman. I'm a recent UEP alum, and now I am a real estate project manager at Fenway CDC in Boston. So thank you organizers for inviting me to help out today. So before we start, just a few things. We're very pleased to welcome these three panelists to our Cities at Tufts Colloquium series. We're joined today by experts, and leaders in tenant organizing and housing justice movement, as well as community care and mutual aid. And while we'd originally envisioned this session being about rent control back in the spring, we're pivoting to focus on the work panelists have done in the housing justice movement, both pre-COVID and during the pandemic. Given the upcoming expiration on the Massachusetts eviction moratorium, the continuing pressures on tenants to pay rent, even when incomes have been disrupted by the pandemic, and health hazards posed by overcrowding or unstable housing, Massachusetts communities are facing multiple housing crises at once. And we're delighted to have these three community liaisons in the virtual room with us today, and we look forward to hearing their perspectives as both community members and organizers. Sorry, just a second. Sorry, clear my throat. So first, a few thank yous. I'd like to thank both Julian and Megan for all of their organizing, our panelists, Penn Low, and then all of you for attending today. Sorry, frog in my throat. So first of all, some introductions. So we have Lisa Owens, who is the Executive Director of the housing justice organization, City Life Vida Urbana, which builds the power and leadership of working class communities, particularly communities of color, to work for social, racial, economic, and gender justice. We have Sharon Cho, who's a Dorchester resident, and alongside other residents has been organizing with Dorchester Not for Sale, arousing housing justice, neighborhood stability, and affordable housing. And then Meridith Levy, who started her role as the ED of Boston Neighborhood Community Land Trust in January of this year. So thank you everyone for joining us. And to start, we have a pretty simple question, which is please describe your work, both professional and personal, over the past couple of years, including before COVID, that is most relevant to this session. And we'll start with Lisa, then hear from Sharon and Meridith.
Thanks, Nick. So I'm super happy to be part of this panel. Definitely with Sharon and Meridith. We all have roles with what was formerly COHIF and now is the Boston Neighborhood Community Land Trust. So I'm super excited to be here. I'm a board member of the Land Trust and as well as the director of City Life. So I wanted to just start this off by framing this discussion by talking about the conditions that communities of color specifically were facing pre-COVID, and now what's at stake if we don't act now that we are in this global public health emergency. So just like the high level points are that as will be a surprise to no one, communities of color pre-COVID were most at risk of eviction and displacement and continue to be to face higher risk factors for both eviction and displacement now, even though we are covered under the law, and that the strategies that vulnerable communities are using to cope with this instability threaten to dig us deeper and deeper into both an economic hole and housing instability, and that this causes a public health risk due to our increasing risk of homelessness. And that there's good news, that there are solutions to promoting housing stability that include both policy, passing policy that is live right now in the State House, as well as longer term investments in anti-displacement strategies like tenant organizing, and also in community and nonprofit ownership and participatory governance, which you can do all of these things through vehicles like community land trusts. So just to say a few points about each of these things. So in the summer, City Life published a report that documented that eviction rates in predominantly Black neighborhoods in Boston are much higher than the eviction rates in white neighborhoods. Our report showed that eviction filings in market rate rental housing were disproportionately occurring across all of Boston's communities of color, and that Black communities were taking a particularly hard hit. And we found, I would really encourage folks to go to the report itself, which I can link to in the chat. But one of the things that actually stood out to us was that, when we started this research over a year ago now, the housing crisis, as we know, was really, really severe and led to these findings. But as we entered the pandemic, we noticed the same trends, that 78% of eviction filings that happened in the month after the stay-at-home order, right before we were protected by the moratorium, 78% of eviction filings in Boston happened in this exact same communities of color that we found were most at risk of displacement pre-COVID. And so after our report, we continued to study these eviction trends just to get a better sense of how to prepare for the coming wave of evictions. And as you have probably heard from various reports and media sources, there is an estimated, the number varies, but it's estimated that over 100,000 people in our state will be at risk of some form of housing instability due to inability to pay rent. But there's a particular piece of data that we think it's important for people to just keep in the top of your minds when you're thinking about housing displacement, housing instability. So the census was doing these weekly, what they called household pulse surveys, where they would survey tens of thousands of renters in Massachusetts, and they would ask them questions about level of confidence in your ability to pay rent the next month, and how you're coping with your economic reality in this, this month, this week. It was a weekly survey. So we found that 1 in 3 renters in Massachusetts said that they were unable to pay their rent and were at risk of eviction after the moratorium ends. That was a shocking number to us. The rent shortfall was estimated to be as high as $429 million as of the end of July. And then MAPC did a report in August, which estimated that going forward, the state would need to come up with $117 million a month just to take into it, just in order to, in rental arrearage, because of the lack of unemployment insurance. So these numbers are staggering. And then when you look at, well, how are Massachusetts residents actually coping with this economic reality? And almost half of Massachusetts residents had been using their stimulus money to pay their housing costs, both rent and mortgage, as of mid-July. And at the end of July, 1 in 3 renters who had little to no confidence in their ability to pay rent were actually relying on some combination of credit cards, stimulus money, or loans from family and friends just to pay their basic housing costs. This this is painting a stark picture for what life is like for everyday people in our state. And it really speaks to the need for immediate action, both at the policy level that will allocate resources to the people who are most in need and most at risk of displacement, but also policy that will protect renters, working class renters and working class homeowners, not just now, but actually at least a year from now, so that we can begin to dig ourselves out of the mess that we find ourselves in due to no fault of our own. And so I guess I'll just end this kind of framing conversation by saying that there is actually a piece of legislation right now in the State House that was crafted by and has been advocated for by over 200 organizations, housing justice and labor allies and social service providers. That act is called the Act to Guarantee Housing Stability. It's sitting in the State House right now. It was co-sponsored by one of the chairs of the Housing Committee, Representative Keuhn, and we have been really spending a lot of energy getting people to put pressure on both DeLeo and Spilka, the leadership, to speedily pass this piece of legislation that would provide immediate relief to working class renters and homeowners and small landlords who own 15 units of property or less, and would create a housing stability fund that would prioritize the resources that the state already has, so that the people who are most in need of relief, both renters and small homeowners, would be able to be first in line, so that the corporate landlords don't take up all of this money. So I'll end there, but hopefully you have a sense of the urgency of what's at stake if we don't together collectively do something to solve this problem. And I think I might be passing this on to Sharon. Is that true?
To Sharon, yeah. So yeah, thank you so much, Lisa. So let's hear from Sharon now.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Sharon. I use she, her pronouns. And yeah, in my day job, I work as a project manager at a local community development corporation in Dorchester. And it's a real privilege to be here. Also speaking with Meridith and Lisa, who have been, leaders in the housing justice world for years. Also feels kind of funny to be sitting on this panel as a, I think, still current UEP student. But a real honor as well. And so I'll talk a little bit more about, in addition to sort of my job as a project manager, my role in housing really has been here really on the local level, organizing alongside other residents with Dorchester Not for Sale. And so I could speak a little bit about some of the work that Dorchester Not for Sale has been working on pre-COVID, as well as speaking to some of the conditions that Lisa had spoken about leading up to COVID-19, and what we're seeing sort of on a neighborhood level. And so for folks who have not heard about Dorchester Not for Sale, Not for Sale is it's a group, it's an alliance of residents, of organizations, local organizations who've been coming together for the last 3 years to build together across, we're a multiracial space, multilingual, multi-generational space, and we're really committed to building a real community process that centers the voice of folks who are most at risk of displacement, and making sure that they're at the table of decision making. And so we're also part of various citywide housing justice spaces, such as the People's Plan space. And we really came about in the last few years in response to a lot of the market rate development that was coming into the neighborhood, as well as in response to some of the rezoning, the city-sponsored rezoning planning processes. And some of the goals of Not for Sale is, to make sure that there is no displacement of current residents, and making sure that we have good jobs for our folks, making sure we preserve our immigrant enclaves, and ensuring quality of life and community safety for our residents. And as I said, in addition to that, making sure that the planning process is democratic, and also that it centers those who are most at risk. And so we've been organizing as a group for the last few years, and we have been holding monthly community dinners, which is a space in which we talk about what's been going on in the neighborhood, where we strategize around what our demands are and the issues that we're seeing, and where we really try to practice decision making on a neighborhood level. And obviously, the pandemic has changed a lot around how we're able to meet and continue to organize. Our monthly community dinners have been put on pause for the time being, and as Lisa's mentioned before, the folks that we're organizing with, the housing crisis was already severe, and I think the pandemic has exacerbated that, because folks are not only dealing with housing insecurity, but people who are living paycheck to paycheck lost their jobs overnight. And so in addition to housing instability, people are having to deal with food insecurity, not having the income to pay for rent, for bills. And so Not for Sale in this pandemic period has really had to shift our energy to really meet the immediate and urgent needs of folks. And throughout the summer, really focused our energy on sort of our mutual aid and community care work. And that's largely looked at like weekly food distribution efforts, as well as providing other mutual aid resources. So we had been able to pull together money and resources to be able to redistribute to folks who need funds to pay for rent, for any, and so yeah, I feel like there's been a lot of conversations around how this pandemic may or may not change our strategies and our demands. Our organizing has largely been in response to a market rate development, and especially in Boston, where we live in a hot real estate market, the threat of displacement for working class communities and communities of color has been just so imminent. And, as we foresee sort of another recession on the horizon, how does that impact our organizing? And, I think what Lisa said earlier really resonates in terms of, I think it's really highlighted that actually what we've been fighting for all along is more urgent, and it shows how important it is. And, as I think we're seeing right now that we're seeing vacancy rates rise in the luxury housing market in Boston, but there's still such a strong demand for affordable housing. And so, really, I feel like it's such important work, the work that, the community land trusts, the housing justice organizers, the work that City Life has been doing, in this period. And so yeah, I'll just sort of end on that note before, I'm sure we'll go into having more discussions, but yeah, just to describe a little bit of what we've been seeing on the neighborhood level. Yeah, I'll pass it off to Meridith.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. See your names, and it's really great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's such an important conversation, and the work we're doing now, we know is going to continue for. It's great to have the UEP community really puzzling over this question, because we're all going to need to work together on it. I went to UEP also many years ago, and we were working on a lot of anti-displacement work in Somerville, where I worked before I started this job at VNCLT. And in Q&A, if Somerville questions come up too, I'm happy to speak on that. But as far as Boston Neighborhood Community Land Trust, one of the things I think in this question of what has been happening in the past versus where are we now with the COVID pandemic, I think our role right now, honestly, well, there are two things. I'll tell you a little bit more about our model, but we have 15 people, 15 households who are residents of our land trust today, thanks to the work of COHIF in years past. And we right now need to make sure that they are stable and that they have a support system. So that's the thing we're working on immediately. But I feel like a really important role for us right now is to set ourselves up to be prepared for this wave of housing instability that we're all talking about. And the best role we can play is to be able to have a mechanism in place to acquire properties into the land trust so that we can hold on to affordability permanently, and so that people can stay in their homes, or as we have vacancies, people can move in. That's really what we need to do. We need to keep people in their neighborhoods and to be able to live there affordably. So BNCLT, Boston Neighborhood Community Land Trust, started, as Lisa mentioned briefly, as COHIF in about 10 years ago, a little bit more, just right after the foreclosure crisis, really with the goal to see how we can make sure people who were threatened by foreclosure could stay in their homes. And over the years, we were able to acquire 6 buildings. So that's how we have 15 homes spread across these 6 buildings. And 2/3 of the residents who live there are considered legacy residents, meaning they lived there before we acquired. So we're able to keep 2/3 of our residents in their homes. And that's our top priority. Though with the land trust, we formed as BNCLT about a year ago, a little more. It gives us some other flexibility and opportunities to try out different models to move the affordable housing, either through ownership, rental, et cetera, onto the land trust, so that people can continue to live there affordably and be part of the governance. This idea that Sharon was just mentioning of community control is really important to us in our model. And so the work that we do with our residents and with neighbors who care about those properties, as well as potentially might become a resident of a BNCLT property in the future, we feel is the central, it's at the center of who we are and how we're going to be successful. So as we gear up for this, what's happening now, but as people are going to have to face their arrearages and they're going to be at high risk of getting evicted or displaced, as well as homes, we might see a new wave of foreclosure. There are a lot of things that we can do. For one, with the model, it's very important that our residents themselves are, they're strong and that they've been able to achieve a model of resiliency. So, it's important to us that people who live there pay lower rents. That's a big part of the model because it's affordable, but even lower than what they might find through other public housing. But if we're able to achieve lower rents, then the fall is less. So in other words, if people have to come up with $1,200 now because of the rent, that's going to add up quickly. Whereas if they're paying half of that, if they live in the BNCLT property, at least their arrearage will be reduced by that much over time. So that's an important mechanism. One is to keep the rents low. And so we have to find subsidies to be able to do that, so that we can afford the property. But the other thing is that the residents themselves are well connected, and our model, we have a stewardship committee to keep the residents in touch with each other so that they can offer support, both as they become leaders and they think about the decisions we need to make as an organization that will help direct how we approach crises like this, but also they can support each other in, if one of our residents isn't able to pay the rent, what can happen is their neighbors can point them to emergency funds, or in the future possibly even build their own emergency funds that they can use, they can tap into in moments of crisis like this. So that kind of community control and community support, I think, makes the CLT community a lot more resilient in times of crisis like this. So a big part of our strategy has to be on acquisition. How are we going to take more properties out of the speculative market and into the land trust? And so there are a lot of ways to do it. It's complicated, but it's really essential that we figure it out. We are reliant again on the great organizing work that organizations on the ground like Dorchester Not for Sale and City Life Vida Urbana are doing, because they are in touch with community members who really care about these issues, and they are the ones with the eyes on the ground who can say, you know what, this property is at risk. There's a really horrible landlord there, and the residents here are already organized and they're ready to move they would love to buy, for example, the property. So as we work with our partnering organizations in these communities, it's easier to understand which properties would be the right ones to move into the land trust. And if the residents are already organized on that property, they're going to be helpful in putting pressure on the landlord, putting pressure with the others, other partners, financing partners, banks, et cetera, to be able to make a deal and move that property. So that's really vital. We also need to push on, through our organizing work, we need to push on city, state policies. So for example, the TOPA, which is the Tenants Opportunity to Purchase Act, it's like a right of first refusal. If we're able to pass it, it gives tenants, and they can work with a community organization, a nonprofit, to purchase. They have a time period where they can actually, before the landlord sells to anyone, the landlord must give notice to the tenants, and if they can organize quickly enough, they have an opportunity to buy that property. Again, if the tenants are already organized through the groups that I've already mentioned and others, they're going to be right there ready to work with an entity to then buy the property. So we need strategies like that in place. Again, it's a great way to move ownership into the hands of community residents, especially those who are most at risk of getting displaced. So that's really important. We also need to think, acquisition is complicated, obviously, but we have to think about, where do we find the subsidies? Because, property, as Sharon mentioned, it's a very high market, we live in a very high market city, so properties are very, very expensive. And then when you figure out what is the value of a property at market, and then you think about the rents that we want to charge, the value goes way down. So we have to figure out a subsidy to create, to fill that gap. Right now, there may be more opportunities here. For one, landlords, if they're not able to collect rents, might be more willing to get rid of their property, to sell it to the land trust. So that's something. If with foreclosure, or if banks start to buy up property, start to take on properties because people aren't able to pay the mortgage, we have another opportunity. Again, it's going to take organizing to push the banks to then sell the properties to organizations like the land trust at lower rates. If we can buy at a lower price, that helps us enormously, so that we can then charge the lower rents that we need to charge. And then we just have to think about other ways to really push our institutions, our lending institutions, to say, we can't, it doesn't work. It's not sustainable to keep the prices so high and to also charge such high interest rates that, I mean, they're not as high as they could be, but to keep us in a place where we can't, it's nearly impossible for us to buy the property. So we have to work with all institutions and all of our partners to say, we need to move properties. We need to figure out ways to identify acquisition funds, lower interest rates, so that we can make this work. We can actually purchase the property, that the residents who live there pay a lower rent. And we also have to think about ownership opportunities, because this is a moment where we might be able to identify people who are ready to buy. Again, we don't want to kill them with high, overwhelming mortgage rates. So there's a lot to be done here, a lot of players, but given the timing of the crisis, we have a call to action, and we have, I think there's, a growing understanding, a shared understanding that we can't do things the same way we've been doing them. And also after the foreclosure crisis, we knew what we needed to do, but we weren't necessarily prepared to do it as fast as we could. But this, now that it's 10 years later, there are new acquisition sources that cities offer. Like in the city of Boston, there's AOP, Acquisition Opportunity Program, and other funds. In Somerville passed others too, but Somerville's using its CPA money to help with acquisition of properties for long-term affordability, permanent affordability. So there are things in place now that weren't 10 years ago during the foreclosure crisis that we can use now for working together. Okay, I'm talking a long time, but that gives you a sense of where we are and where we need to go. Thanks.
Great. Thank you to our panelists. So just a quick point, if you didn't see that Becky posted in the chat earlier, if you have any questions for the panelists at the end, we'll leave about 15 minutes and you can send them to Becky or Katie Swan privately, or you can also just post them in the chat. So it's a little trickier to do over Zoom than in person, but I just want to leave a space, about a little bit of time, to see if any of the panelists want to respond or comment on any of the things that the other panelists have said. So I'll just leave a little bit of space and you can think for a moment, and if we don't have anything, we can move on to the next question. Okay, so I guess we can move on then. So I had a couple other questions lined up as well, but you all, give very thorough answers, so answered many of them. So shifting gears a little bit, or I guess just asking on a little bit of a different scale, I'm curious to hear what each of your organizations, that you work with both professionally and outside of professional work, are doing in this very, very uncertain time to manage that uncertainty. So whoever wants to jump in first and respond to that can.
So I can say that we have implemented we've basically tried our best to adapt to this new reality by making our organizing as digital as possible. Which, as you can imagine, is difficult because the folks that we typically have as our membership base are seniors, people without access to technology, or who have limited access to Wi-Fi, particularly. So we have done a few things. We implemented an emergency eviction hotline, which at this point has generated about 2,100 calls, which is definitely more than twice the number of folks that we worked with all of last year. So that's one thing. So our emergency eviction hotline is people's first sort of entryway into the organization, and it really runs the gamut from people who themselves think they're experiencing illegal evictions or self-help evictions, to folks that have questions about the law, to providers who are working with clients and they want to know the best way to advise their folks. So it runs the gamut. Additionally, we have we have twice weekly meetings that we run on Zoom for residents who are experiencing issues with their housing and other community allies. And we try to make that accessible by also simultaneously broadcasting that on Facebook Live, because lots of our folks are able to access at least Facebook Live. And we have been experimenting more and more with socially distant ways to come together through rallies and standouts and actions. So over the past, I would say, 3 months, we've had a number of actions that involve tenant associations standing out in their building, around their building, holding signs, being in solidarity with other tenant associations across the city or in different cities. And we pair that with car caravans that actually go city to city, neighborhood to neighborhood. And we broadcast all of this on Zoom because people really want to feel connected more than ever. And so we're trying to figure out ways to both be safe, but to increase the level of, decrease the alienation and isolation and increase the feeling of community and solidarity.
Yeah, I think I participated in one of those car caravans and really love just the creativity that this time has inspired in all of us. And so, yeah, for us with some of the Dorchester organizing work, it's certainly, yeah, so much of organizing has to do with you know, seeing people, meeting people, talking to people. You know, I know a lot of us, when you know, social distancing measures were put in place, we were like, can we even door knock? Can we go door knocking or canvassing? We can't be knocking on people's door right now. And so I think it did present a lot of challenges. And I think there are some, you know, I feel like some online infrastructure that in some of the organizing spaces where people have been practicing that. And I think it's really shed light on sort of other accessibility needs as well. I think it's allowed actually some folks to participate more in some ways. And of course, there are some downsides I think Zoom fatigue is so real. You know, yeah, video conferencing is not accessible to everyone at the same time. And for us, because so much of our work had shifted to some of the mutual aid work as well, and our weekly food distribution work, we actually, there's some person-to-person distance contact as well. And it's actually, you know, I think in addition to some of the you know, video conference organizing, I think it's allowed us to stay connected in different ways. But yeah, I think this period really challenges us to thinking about, you know, what do, you know, every summer we have a Dot Day parade, and, you know, which was canceled, you know, and that's sort of a huge opportunity for us to, you know, meet new folks and base build and identify residents. And, you know, all of those things are so much harder now. But I am really inspired by some of the creative organizing that's been coming out of this period. You know, I think I've also participated in some car actions as well, and there's some traffic and logistical challenges to that. But yeah, it's been really cool to see some of the creative, yeah, alternative actions that people have been coming up with.
I'm wondering, I feel like those answers were awesome in this question. I'm wondering if there's some questions in the thread. Should we start answering some of those?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to start asking some. Yeah, we have some very good questions lined up here. So let's start with the question from Ellie. So this would be a particularly good question for folks who are figuring out thesis topics. So in terms of academic research on the topic of housing stability and eviction, what are the questions that will be most pressing to answer in the next few months?
Seems like a good question for Lisa.
Yeah, you know, the research questions that we pursue typically take longer than a few months to answer. So I am challenged by the time frame. I'll say that you know, the piece of research that we are definitely staying on top of is how you know, sort of who is most at risk. So first of all, what are some of the anticipated, and to the extent that we can try to figure out unanticipated consequences of the moratorium not being extended, but so a smaller number of Massachusetts residents would still be covered under the federal moratorium. And so what are the impacts anticipated and unanticipated? How are people coping with this ever-changing economic reality? And so kind of intermediate, those are the things that we are tracking. Long term, we are always looking at the impact of corporate landlords in our neighborhoods. So we're very interested in figuring out who the corporate landlords are, what patterns of displacement exist in our neighborhoods, what are the potential civil rights violations might there be. Yeah, so and those are longer term areas of sort of research and investigation.
On that last point too, from the perspective of the CLT and acquisition, I think it would be great to figure out if there are ways, like what are the indicators or what are the things that make us think a landlord might be willing to sell the property or is going to walk away from the property. Are they close to foreclosure? You know, how do we know? I mean, there's a lot of work, obviously, that we just learned from the tenants. That's the best way. But are there other ways to figure out what's going on in a neighborhood and which property owners specifically are vulnerable or who may be interested in selling?
Okay, great. Thank you. So we have a question here from the Brown House Watch Party. So today's Boston Globe reported a 14% increase in home prices in the Boston area. And how does this complicate pandemic housing affordability and eviction?
Well, maybe to state the obvious, that if one of our main goals is property acquisition, and to specifically take residential housing out of the private market and into long-term affordability, that definitely complicates our ability to do that. It's also worth noting that the principal way that we get property onto the land trust is through community organizing. So so to the extent that that the upward price in housing in the area sort of leads to a ripple effect of other property owners wanting to sort of cash in and raise rents, to the extent that that creates a fight between the tenant association and the landlord, those are the circumstances under which we do our organizing, and we say, if you are not able to keep rents at an affordable level and to negotiate in good faith with your tenants around affordable rents, then the demand is you should sell your property to a nonprofit organization that can meet that obligation. So in the event that we are successful, the Land Trust has 16 units of housing so far. In the event that we're successful, the Land Trust has to, as Meridith was saying, cobble together all sorts of financing from likely and unlikely sources to be able to purchase that property. And this is not an optimal environment to be doing that. So.
And I think that article also, it talks about sort of that increase being a product of the imbalance of supply and demand. The demand is still strong, but homeowners are not selling their homes. And I guess, I feel like I think housing production is oftentimes highlighted as sort of the key way in which we address the housing crisis. And I guess thinking about how it connects to eviction and affordability is that, I think we really need to also focus on how are we preserving existing housing that people already live in as well, because those are the homes that are at risk of speculators, of being flipped. It's the homes that we live in right now, right? And the need for protection, for tenant protection as well, which at the current moment the eviction moratorium is doing. But I think we also need measures in place long term that'll protect tenants. And and I guess I just want to highlight also just overall, just taking a step back from sort of the mechanics of housing, the production, supply, and demand, just the importance of power and building people power and the role of organizing in all of that as well. I think we see in moments of crises like this, the ways in which corporate real estate interest, the landscape, there's such a power imbalance. And so I think the importance of building infrastructure for models like the Community Land Trust is so important. And also it really highlights the importance of continued and ongoing organizing of people, so that, the folks who are most at risk are well organized and can sort of counterbalance corporate real estate interests.
I think it's just also just a great, to piggyback on what Sharon said, it's a great moment to tell the story because people are sympathetic. And there's so much going on all levels. And I saw in the thread Laura Goldman's question about how these issues all intersect, but racism, people are outraged right now. People are losing their jobs without employment protection. They can't pay their bills. So this is a moment to be loud. It's a very important election year. So obviously, so there's a story to be told. We are telling that story. And there are, I think that folks who are decision makers, like who might have resources to help us do this work, if they're sitting in government, they're probably sympathetic, but they feel like their hands are tied. But if we're doing that push and we're helping them make sure that they prioritize on their budget X, Y, and Z that we think will help, we can help them solve the problem. We have to be there. So I totally agree about the organizing, and the story is just, this is a strong moment to tell the story.
Great, thanks. So it looks like we have time for one more question. Meridith just referenced this, but we'll take Lori's question of, all panelists noted the interrelated issues of housing, employment, food security, and other needs. What are the new opportunities for alliances across these silos? And what are the challenges of dedicating scarce time and attention resources to those efforts?
Can I actually, sorry, can I actually address Allison's question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so yeah, this is a really important question. Why City Life makes a distinction between small landlords and corporate landlords. It goes back to what Sharon was talking about in terms of building power. So City Life believes that, so first of all, our mission is systemic transformation. The housing system is a system that's built on profit over people, and it is, so our housing system is part of our overall economic system, which is extractive in nature, being a capitalist system. We believe that that we are going to, in order to change this system into a system that actually puts the needs of people over profit, and where human development and planetary sustainability is really at the center, we're going to need a wide, sort of a wide coalition of interests and forces to do that. And City Life's part in that is to organize working class tenants and working class homeowners who are the closest to displacement. And so in our base, we have people who are tenants who have received dramatic rent increases and have become radicalized by their recognition that they, along with their community members, can fight back against these big corporate landlords. We also have in our base people who have taken on predatory loans, African American folks who who come from families and communities that themselves were victims of redlining, and then years and years and years later, they're able to get a loan to do home repair, to fix up their second unit where often family members are, and perhaps they're on fixed income. And we saw during the last economic crisis that it was people of color, and particularly Black homeowners, who lost their homes and their connections to community. Those people are also in our base. So we actually say that the interests of small homeowners are closer to the interests of working class tenants than their interests are to the big corporations like City Realty or Advanced Property Management here in Boston. And we make a concerted effort to organize them into our base.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Meridith or Sharon, do you have any responses to that we can end on this question then?
Yeah,
Very good question.
I guess I just want to echo, everything Lisa had said, and that, in our organizing, it's, I think the folks who are most at risk tend to be tenants and renters, and we acknowledge that. But we're organizing to have a healthy, stable, affordable neighborhood for community safety. And, there are certain, as Lisa mentioned, we live in a capitalist system. And so much of people's, whether it's your retirement, your safety net, the reality is, it is so much of that is tied up in your property. And so I guess in our organizing, I think we want to center those who are most at risk of displacement, but it's not a tenant versus landlord. I think what we're focusing on is community versus capital, right? And we're fighting sort of for the you know, the future of our neighborhoods. And, you know, that includes tenants and that includes small landlords.
I'm just gonna sort of say, in general, I think the bigger vision is to put property into the hands of the community, and for people who are interested in you know, racial justice, equity, all kinds of things, like for the good of the community. And that may include unusual partners. Ideally, we can appeal to small landlords, but also it includes you know, agriculture, it includes good jobs, it includes, you know, cooperatives, and it includes thinking about models. Someone had asked this in the thread, but models for building equity. So it's like over time, as we're building this, we're able to create both a vision, but then that vision is placed onto an address that includes all of these things, where people feel like this is my place and I'm making the decisions about what happens on this place. So we do need to think about who are the allies, and it is an interesting mix. And if we can get small landlords involved in that vision, that's even better. So anyway, I think that's where I'll end.
Great, so I guess we'll wrap things up there. I just want to give a big thank you again to all three of our panelists on this. This was very, very interesting and important. And a big thank you to Cities at Tufts for organizing this. And again, to Becky and Katie and to Penn for all their organizational help. So thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you later.
Thank you so much, Nick. And as we wrap up, I'm just going to share a quick slide with contact information. There were so many great important questions that came up in the chat. And if you'd like to reach out to any of us or any of the panelists, please feel free to do so. Bear with me a moment as I share my screen.